Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first ever Cache Valley Historical Society Zoom event. I'm thrilled that you were able to join us virtually for this presentation. I am Courtney Coachley, and I'm the president of the Cache Valley Historical Society. Jennifer Duncan and I will be acting as moderators throughout this event. Tonight, we have noted professionals Richard Turley and Curt Bench discussing Mark Hofmann. Scott Bushman will properly introduce them in a few minutes. But first, I'm going to go over some housekeeping and etiquette rules. Since this is our first time meeting on Zoom, we apologize for any technical glitches that may happen, so please bear with us. We are also recording this presentation, but not the question and answer portion. So if you get booted off, we will get it shared online within a few days. Be sure to keep your microphones muted if you are not muted when you come into the room. Each presenter will talk for about 15 minutes with plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. If you would like to ask a question, we request that you put it in the chat feature found at the bottom of your screen. If you are not on a computer, use the raise hand feature, which can be found if you click on participants at the bottom and then chat. We'll keep an eye on that. If you have any technical issues during the meeting, you can send a direct chat to either Jennifer or me, and we will try to get that addressed. If you are not a member of the Cache Valley Historical Society, we encourage you to join. We do multiple events and lectures throughout the year, and the best way to stay up to date on all of that is to follow us on Facebook. We're still working on a firm plan for our May lecture, which we hope to have in person at the Historic Courthouse in Cache County, but we may do Zoom again depending on who our speaker is and how things are looking in a few weeks. It will be on Wednesday, May 12th at 7 p.m. So go ahead and plan that in your schedule. And we hope to see you then. Thanks for attending. And here is Scott to properly introduce our speakers.
Well, thank you very much, Courtney. It is a real pleasure and an honor to introduce our two speakers tonight. Let me add a personal note. I know these men from an association with the Utah Westerners, and we have shared many events together. We have visited the Battle of the Little Bighorn battlefield. We've looked for gold in Sacramento. We've wandered the West on field trips. And I think I know these guys fairly well. They're great people, and it's a real honor to have them tonight to talk about Hofmann here. So I'll start with Curt Bench. Curt was born and raised in Southern California, but he returned to his native Utah roots in 1971. In 1976, he graduated from BYU in communications and worked for Deseret Book Company for 14 years, most of that time as a store manager and eventually managing the fine and rare books department. After closure of the department early in the post-Hofmann era, Curt started his own book store, Benchmark Books, which specializes in Mormon, Utah, and Western American books and materials, and has been in operation since 1987. Curt has published several articles and books in his field and has contributed to various books and publications from other publishers. He is a lifelong bibliophile and student of history. Curt was a member of the editorial board of Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, for several years. He has been a member of the Utah Westerners and Mormon History Association for many years and is an honorary life member of the Utah State Historical Society. Curt is happily married to Pat Bench, his wife, who generally tolerates his bookish ways, and he is the proud father of 4 children whom also love books. And I know his kids, and they are special kids. So welcome, Curt. Our second guest is Richard Turley. Richard E. Turley is a Utah writer who has served for 3 decades as a historian for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. For 22 of those years, he was managing director of Church Historical Department. For 12 years, he also served concurrently as managing director of the Family History Department. In 2008, he became an assistant church historian and recorder. Before retiring in 2020, he also served for 4 years as managing director of the Public Affairs and Church Communications Department. He is the author or editor of more than 20 books on Latter-day Saints in U.S. Western history, and the recipient of numerous history and writing awards. He has also served on many boards and committees for historical and community functions at local universities. His first book, Victims, the LDS Church and Mark Hofmann Case, Urbana University of Illinois Press in 1992, was a regional bestseller and remains in print today. I might also add that Richard has numerous books, and I tend to own most of them, I think, in their signed editions. So again, we'd like to welcome Richard Turley. And so at this time, I'll turn the time over to Curt Bench. Thank you.
Well, hello. It's an honor for me to have been invited, along with my esteemed colleague and friend, Richard Turley, to speak to you tonight. I was not familiar with the Cache Valley Historical Society until recently, but I'm really glad that you're keeping history alive up there, up to the north. And so I thought what I would do is tell you a little bit about my experience with Mark Hofmann. Many of you have probably seen the new Netflix documentary, Murder Among the Mormons. And you're probably at least somewhat familiar with this case, even though it's more than 3 decades old now. But I had many experiences with what turned out to be a master forger, con man, liar, murderer, forger. And I've often told people that I would much rather have read about all this than lived through it, but I did live through it, and fortunately, I should say. So I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background with me and with Mark Hofmann, and then Rick will take it. I'll take you up to about the time of the bombings in 1985, and then Rick will carry the story forward from there, and then we'll be happy to answer questions after that. I met Mark probably about 1981. I was a manager for Deseret Book Company, managed 2 of the branch stores, and then eventually created what we called the Fine and Rare Books department. And so for my last 3 years plus in the company, I managed that operation, in which we specialized in we did have some new, but mostly used, out of print, and even rare books, documents, and other collectibles. It was kind of a pioneering effort for Deseret Book Company. They'd never done anything like that before. And I was just more than excited to take that on as a full-time job, as opposed to managing a branch store and then doing that sort of as a sideline. So I met Mark. This was after he was already well known for having discovered, I put that in air quotes, the famous or infamous Anton transcript, which reportedly was in Joseph Smith's own hand, a copying of the characters that were taken from the gold plates of the Book of Mormon. And Mark said that he had discovered it in a family Bible that he had purchased, and he became well known for that. And then there were a number of other things along the way for which he became well known. A letter from Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph Smith's mother, eventually, of course, the infamous White Salamander letter, or the Salamander letter. But I met him after he was gaining some notoriety. And when I finally met him, it was kind of like meeting a minor rock star. And we got to know each other. We ended up doing a lot of business together over the course of 3 years, hundreds of thousands of dollars in business. Mark was what I felt was a good friend, as well as a business associate. And we got some amazing things from him. We got signed documents by not just famous Mormon characters such as Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and Parley P. Pratt, Orson Pratt, Orrin Porter Rockwell, who was illiterate. And so we had a signed document with his ex, Elijah Abel, who was an early Black Latter-day Saint that was also illiterate. And we had a document signed by him with his ex. We had, but beyond the Mormon field, and we got rare books and as well as documents and all kinds of things, but also we branched out into more Americana items that we got from Mark, such as documents signed by Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, Martha Washington, Daniel Boone, various other people that you would know the names of. And sometimes these things would be very saleable and other times not. But it was a fascinating time. And I did things socially with Mark. We had lunch together very often. Sometimes we would get together events at his home with our wives. And I thought I was pretty good friends with Mark. People will read or see documentaries such as the one that was just on, or hear stories, and they say to me, well, I guess you knew Mark Hofmann pretty well, didn't you? And I say, well, no, actually I didn't, apparently. I didn't know him. I didn't know the true Mark Hofmann. I don't know if anybody does, but in any case, we did a lot of business together. And as I said, we did things socially. And over a period of time, things usually went pretty well. Mark would bounce checks occasionally, but we just figured that was one of his many quirks. He did have some little quirks. He was always late for things. You couldn't ever call him on the phone and reach him. You'd have to leave a message, which became kind of a key thing as things got darker and more scary over time. And I'll try to get to that. But there came a time when it was apparent that Mark was getting into some financial trouble. And I knew that he owed money, and we had some very large transactions. At one point, we purchased a letter that was reportedly written by Joseph Smith to Jonathan Dunham, who was the head of the Nauvoo Legion in Nauvoo, in which Joseph asks Dunham to bring the Nauvoo Legion and to rescue the prisoners in the Carthage jail and, you know, break them out. That was, as far as I know, the highest amount ever paid for a Mormon document at the time. And it was $100,000 back in the mid 80s, which is a lot of money, still is a lot of money. But Mark was waiting to get a lot of money, as much as $1.5 million from the Library of Congress for a document that many of you have probably heard of, the Oath of a Free Man, which was reportedly the first printed document in America. And he supposedly discovered it at a New York bookstore and bought it for $25 and was trying to sell it for 1.5 million. There's a whole story behind that, but since it failed to sell, Mark got into a lot of financial difficulty and owed a lot of people a lot of money. And this became apparent the one occasion when usually Mark was very soft-spoken and quiet and subtle, not given to becoming emotional, and I never really saw him rattled until this one day that he came and was very desperately trying to raise money because he owed a lot of people money, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. I'm really simplifying and doing this briefly. And he tried to raise some money with us at Deseret Book, and we weren't able to accommodate him. But in the meantime, since he had defaulted on a major loan to a bank, local bank, a gentleman by the name of Steve Christensen, of course, you know who he is, was attempting to intervene and on behalf of a couple of members of the church, LDS church hierarchy, and was passing on information to me to pass on to Mark, saying that if he didn't make good on this loan, that there could be some very dire consequences for him, church-wise and business-wise. And I won't go into all the details, but Steve was really attempting to get Mark to live up to his commitments and was putting a lot of pressure on him. And then, as most of you know, in mid-October of 1985, a bomb went off in the Judge Building in downtown Salt Lake City, and Steve Christensen was killed by that bomb. And then later that afternoon, another bomb went off in Holiday, killing Kathy Sheets, the wife of Gary Sheets, who had been Steve Christensen's business partner earlier, and they had run into financial difficulties. So there was the city and the area was in an uproar, and there was all kinds of fear and consternation and wondering what this was all about. Nothing like this had ever happened in Salt Lake City. And there were two theories early on that the bombings could be related to either the Sheets Christensen old business partnership, or it could be related to Mormon documents, and specifically perhaps the Salamander letter that I imagine Rick will probably tell you something about. And so a lot of us were very worried. We didn't know who the targets were. We didn't know why this was going on. And then the next day after these two killings, another bomb went off, injuring Mark Hofmann. And he was not only portrayed by the authorities and on the news as a victim, but now was being looked at as a suspect in the bombings. And that changed everything. So I and others went to the police to tell them what we knew, to see if it would be relevant. But it was because Mark had been our friend and business associate and we trusted him totally, it was quite a while before we ever believed that he was guilty of any crime, let alone forgery and murder. But that's part of the story that I think Rick is planning to tell you. And so it was a strange time, a surreal time, a very frightening time, and one that is hard to explain. But many of you probably have memories of that period. We all have those, but they're each different. So if you have any questions later in the program, let me know. I'll be happy to answer. I'm sure I've only stimulated a little bit of discussion here, but in the time that I have, hope I haven't gone over. Rick, take it away. I can't hear you, Rick.
He needs to be unmuted.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. I first met Curt Bench at the Deseret Book Fine and Rare Books department, where he sold me books, and we've been friends ever since then. I continue to purchase books from Curt because of his honesty, because of his understanding of the field, and because of his longstanding friendship, not only with me, but with most of the people who are in the community that studies Latter-day Saint history in depth. I have never met Mark Hofmann, however. When the bombs went off in October of 1985, I was practicing law in downtown Salt Lake City. I had an office that was in the Key Bank Tower, and it looked north towards the Salt Lake Temple. In the summertime, when they cranked the oval windows open in the assembly room at the top of the temple, I could see through those windows and out the other side of the temple and down inside the assembly room. From my high school days, I had become deeply involved in the study of Latter-day Saint history. It was something that had intrigued me since age 15. And by the time I graduated from high school, I knew a great deal about the topic. In fact, I had been designated the academic vice president of the Salt Lake Valley North Seminary District Council when I was a senior in high school, which made me responsible for writing Seminary Bowl questions on church history topics for 15 schools in the Salt Lake Valley, and then judging those competitions. So I was, by necessity, designated the expert in the field for those 15 schools. When I became an undergraduate, I continued my interest in church history. I graduated in English, but I was a member of the honors program, and in order to graduate with highest honors, I had to complete what was called a University Scholar Project. And given my interest in church history, I worked with the chairman of the history department, James B. Allen, who was formerly an assistant church historian under Leonard Arrington, to prepare a project under his mentorship, which was a great experience for me. I then went on to law school, where I took a full battery of business and tax courses in preparation for becoming a lawyer, but also took all of the history-related courses that I could because I was so entrenched in that subject. When the bombs went off in 1985, I was working with a Chicago-based law firm in its Salt Lake office. And a few weeks later, I received a telephone call out of the blue from a man who identified himself and then said in lawyer speak, "I'm representing an undisclosed principal," meaning I'm calling on behalf of somebody whose name I cannot give you. He then proceeded to say to me, "I understand you're interested in church history." And I said, "Yeah, it's true, I am." And he said, "What's the likelihood that on a free Saturday afternoon you'd be studying about church history?" And I said, "Well, pretty good." And he then proceeded to ask me a lot of other questions about church history, and then he hung up. And I leaned back and thought to myself, that is the weirdest phone call I have ever had in my life. The bombs had gone off just a few weeks before. Church history was on everybody's minds. And suddenly this cold caller called to ask me about my interest in the subject. Not long after that, I received a telephone call from a man named Dallin H. Oakes, who the year before had been made a member of the Quorum of 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He invited me to lunch. We went to lunch, and long story short, by the end of the week, I'd been offered the job of being the managing director of the church history department, which is the head of the department. I was a ripe 29 years old at the time. And the invitation to have all of the keys and combinations and access to all the church's historical collections at age 29 seemed overwhelming to me. I was willing to give up what ended up probably being tens of millions of dollars of future income in exchange for the opportunity to have access to all those materials and run the church's history operations. And so as was mentioned by Scott in the introductions, that's how I spent the bulk of my career. And when I arrived as an employee at church headquarters on January 20th, 1986, I ended up in what was effectively a crime scene. Investigators were trying to find a motive for murder. Mark Hofmann had been the victim of the third bomb, and some investigators had suspicions that he might in fact be the bomber, but they had no motive for the bombing. And many of the people who surrounded him were defending him adamantly. And they were doing so for many reasons. One was that they thought there was no way that a bumpkin, and that's how they often saw him, somebody who was kind of a soft-spoken, quiet man who often didn't seem to know much, they couldn't see that he could do anything that would lead to the bombing murders of two people and the bombing of himself. Investigators began to pursue the possibility that his documents were forgeries. And so they came to us and they asked for copies of all the Hofmann documents we owned, plus copies of documents we knew were incontrovertibly authentic, so that they could compare them. Then they set up a little laboratory and they began to look at these documents. So even though I never met Mark Hofmann, I became a fly on the wall in the midst of this wonderful investigation that occurred, as the document examiners were looking for a motive for murder. Now, something you need to understand that I describe in great detail in my book about the case, Victims, the LDS Church and the Mark Hofmann case, is that document examiners had looked at Hofmann's documents before. And some of these document examiners were very sophisticated. Kenneth Rendell was a document dealer in New York and later Boston. In addition to that, there were people who had served in government positions as forensic document examiners. Let me just give you an example here. When Hofmann had his second major find, the Joseph Smith III blessing, that document was set before some pretty sophisticated document examiners. One of those was James R. Dabowski, the retired chief of the Cincinnati Postal Crime Laboratory. And another one was Albert W. Summerford, who was the retired head of the Question Documents Laboratory of the Bureau of the Chief Postal Inspector in Washington, D.C. Dabrowski had examined over 250,000 documents in his lifetime, testified in more than 500 courts, and lectured and written extensively on question document examinations. Summerford, an expert certified by the American Board of Forensic Document Examiners, had spent about 40 years in the same profession. And after careful analysis, both experts concluded that the text of that blessing document was in the handwriting of Thomas Bullock, the purported author, and that the notation Joseph Smith III blessing was written by Joseph Smith Jr. Summerford microscopically examined the inks on the blessing and comparison documents and found them indistinguishable. All were iron gallatanic inks, which he noted had remained in common use into the mid-20th century. The document had been folded in the correct way for historical purposes. That document was also clipped, and a 1" by 2 millimeter sample was sent to Walter C. McCrone Associates for a scientific analysis. The analysis found the paper was made from cotton, hemp, and straw, suggesting it was produced between 1800 and 1890. The paper filler was mostly crushed mica, an additive that had come into use beginning about 1807. The sizing was starch, something used for that purpose for centuries. The report found nothing to suggest the paper was not made during the mid-19th century. So beginning with his earliest major finds, the Anthon transcript, the Joseph Smith III blessing, and then, of course, the Salamander letter, the documents were submitted to experts who reviewed them and declared them to be authentic. So what was happening now that was different? If forensic document examiners had looked at them before, what made the difference now? And the answer is what Curt said. The bombing made all the difference. Once murder was the major crime and not potential forgery, then they looked harder and longer and with more intent than anyone ever had before at the documents. If these documents were forgeries, then suddenly Mark Hofmann had a motive for murder and would be considered the chief suspect in all 3 bombings, including of himself. So the document examiners took the documents we provided for them and others provided. They took the authentic documents and they studied them over and over and over again, initially finding nothing wrong with them. And then they thought there's got to be something here, something that has to exist that lets us know what documents are Hofmann forgeries and which ones are not. Finally, George Throckmorton, one of the 2 document examiners, detected that there might be some cracking in the ink of the Hofmann documents that differed from what he saw in the original documents. So he told Bill Flynn, his associate forensic document examiner, he said, I want you to hand me a document. Don't tell me whether it was from Hofmann or not, just hand me a document, and I will tell you on the basis of microscopic examination whether it's from Hofmann or not. And so Bill handed him a document, and he said, Hofmann. And Bill said, that's correct. Then he handed another one, and he said, not Hofmann. And Bill said, that's correct. Well, it turned out that this telltale alligator-like cracking of the ink at a microscopic level resulted from one of the ways that Mark Hofmann had artificially aged his inks. And it became a distinguishing factor. Now, that alone would not have been sufficient because it turns out that inks do crack as they get older. And a good defense attorney would have been able to defend against that. But that gave them encouragement, and they continued to look further. And before long, they began to look at the documents under ultraviolet light and had seen things that had not been seen previously. From the very beginning, the Anthon transcript had been examined under various lights, including ultraviolet and infrared, and nobody could see anything wrong with them. But the more these document examiners put together the entire corpus of Hofmann material, the more they began to see telltale signs of forgery. For example, Hofmann had apparently dipped some of his documents into a solution that was intended to artificially age them, and then he would hang the documents up to dry with clothespins on a line. What that drying did was it left streaks as the liquid dripped down, streaks that were unnatural. If the document had been natural and had been written on a flat surface, the ink and anything in the ink should have radiated in a uniform way. But in these particular documents, they radiated in another direction. Well, continuing to look at these documents, they began to find mounting evidence that Hofmann was in fact the forger. They also began to do work on his finances, which were abysmal. And they began to look back and see the very kinds of things that Curt was describing, that he was under a tremendous amount of financial difficulty at the time. And taking the totality of the evidence, as lawyers say, they were able to build a case against him. They went to his defense attorney. It looked like this was a potentially a capital crime that could send him to prison with the death penalty over his head. And so they ultimately entered into a plea agreement in early 1987 that included a provision that Mark Hofmann would talk about what he had done. And so finally the news broke. Many of the people who had long supported him continued to support him to that moment because they couldn't possibly imagine that someone of Mark Hofmann's personality could do something so violent, or that he was smart enough to forge the documents at the level that he did. I remember I was in a room on the second floor of the east wing of the church office building, standing next to one of the people who knew Mark Hofmann and had been a supporter of him to that moment, as we listened to the news conference announcing the plea bargain agreement and that Mark Hofmann had pleaded guilty. And I remember that person who had long defended Hofmann turning to me and saying, "I feel stupid," because he had defended him to that very moment. So that led in turn to my saying to myself, well, having been a fly on the wall through all of this and having had access to all the information about Mark Hofmann, I had to write a book on the subject. So I wrote my book, and I wrote it in a different way from any other book written on the subject, in that I give the reader not retrospective points of view about what's going on at the time, but I meter out the evidence exactly as it comes into the picture over time. So that in reading the book, you can understand precisely how Hofmann worked his con and precisely why it was successful. So now Curt and I will take questions.